It was supposed to be a celebration, a family party filled with laughter, food, and memories. But halfway through, my son pointed at me and shouted across the room, "Mom, please leave. You're embarrassing us." The music stopped. The air turned heavy. I remember holding my shawl, confused, as every pair of eyes turned toward me. I walked out without a word, but what none of them knew was who had seen it and what he'd already decided to do. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and drop a heart if you like the story. The room was bright with laughter and music when it happened. Glasses clinked, the smell of roast and wine filled the air, and everyone seemed happy. Until my son's voice cut through the noise. He stood in the middle of the room, face flushed, and said loudly, "Mom, please leave. You're embarrassing us." For a second, no one moved. Then, the whispers started. His wife looked away, pretending to fix her dress. My heart pounded as I felt every eye turn toward me. The fork in my hand slipped and clattered onto the floor, louder than the music had been just moments before. I didn't speak. My throat felt tight, but I refused to cry in front of them. I reached for my shawl, folded it neatly around my shoulders, and walked toward the door. The laughter had died, the conversations frozen mid-sentence. The air was heavy, heavy with judgment, shame, and something worse, indifference. My own son stood there, unmoved, watching me leave his home as if I were an uninvited guest. The very home he grew up in, the home I helped build. Outside, the night air was cold. I could still hear faint music through the windows, but it no longer sounded like celebration. It sounded like betrayal. I stood at the edge of the porch, gripping the railing for balance. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the realization that my son, my only son, had chosen humiliation over respect. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. I wouldn't let anyone see me break. As I took one step down, I glanced through the window. My husband was still inside, sitting in his chair, silent. His face was unreadable, calm, but not detached. He wasn't smiling like the others, not even pretending. Our eyes met for a brief second, and in that small, wordless moment, I knew something had shifted in him. There was a stillness about him I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. The car ride home felt endless. The driver didn't speak, and I didn't want him to. Streetlights blurred past like fading memories, each one reminding me of something I'd done for that boy. His first uniform, his first apartment, his wedding. I had been there for all of it. I had given everything, time, health, pride, so that he could stand tall in life. And now, he stood taller than me, not in success, but in arrogance. When I reached home, the house felt emptier than usual. I placed my shawl on the chair, sat by the window, and stared into the dark garden. Somewhere, far off, I could still hear echoes of the party, the clinking of glasses, the false laughter. My chest ached, but not from pain, from disappointment, because I realized something that night. You can raise a child to be strong, educated, and independent, but if you forget to teach them gratitude, you raise a stranger instead. Hours passed before I heard the familiar sound of the front door creaking open. My husband's slow steps echoed down the hallway. He didn't say a word, just hung his coat and walked toward the living room. When he sat beside me, I could feel the quiet fire in him. He didn't need to ask what happened. He'd seen enough. He reached for my hand, squeezed it once, and nodded. That was all. In that silence, I understood that something had already begun. What I didn't know then was that the moment my son raised his voice to me, the balance of our family shifted. That night might have felt like defeat, but it was actually the beginning of something else. Something that would make him face the truth he'd buried under pride. I had walked out quietly, but someone else, the man I'd stood beside for 40 years, was already planning what would come next. Before that night, I believed our family stood on strong ground, built by love, loyalty, and shared struggle. My husband and I had started with almost nothing. He worked in a small workshop repairing machines, and I took evening jobs sewing uniforms for the local school. Every pound was saved, every bill planned. We didn't live richly, but we lived right. When our son was born, we promised each other that he would never face the same hardship we did. Everything we built from that moment on was for him. As the years passed, our efforts began to show. The business my husband started from our garage grew into something real, small, steady, and honest. I kept the books, managed the accounts, and made sure every deal had a receipt. My husband used to say I had better sense for money than most men in town. Maybe he was right, but I never took pride in it. My pride was in my family, in the thought that one day our son would continue what we started. When he was old enough, we paid for his education, every tuition fee scraped from savings that could have gone to comfort. I sold jewelry, postponed medical care, and went without holidays. My husband worked through his pain, and I worked through mine. Every sacrifice felt lighter because it had a name, his. When he graduated, he stood between us in his cap and gown, smiling proudly. I thought that smile meant gratitude. I realize now it meant ambition. After his father's health began to fail, we let him take charge of the company. It felt natural, a passing of the torch. Everyone said he was sharp, confident, modern. He called meetings, signed papers, traveled for deals. People admired him for his success. They said we'd raised a leader. What they didn't know was that behind that success stood two old hands who never stopped working, the quiet kind of work no one claps for. In those early days, I didn't mind being behind the scenes. I believed loyalty didn't need recognition. But loyalty, I learned, can make you invisible. As the company grew, so did the distance. He began speaking in terms of mine, not ours. The house we'd built together became his home. The staff we trained became his team. Every trace of us, every memory, every contribution began to fade from his version of success. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone, laughing with clients, calling himself self-made. Those words cut deeper than any insult. To be erased by strangers is one thing. To be erased by your own child, that's something else entirely. When my husband's illness worsened, I thought our son would soften, but instead, he grew harder, impatient, distracted, too busy to visit. He said he was managing things. I tried to believe him. I told myself that pressure changes people, that maybe, deep down, the boy who once ran into my arms still existed. But when I saw his face at the party, that sharp, cold look, I realized he wasn't the boy anymore. He was a man who'd forgotten where he came from. And maybe that was our mistake. We gave him everything except struggle. We taught him to win, but not to value those who built the path for him to walk on. Still, that night, when I walked out of his house humiliated, my heart didn't hate him. It broke for him. Because I knew what my husband and I had given him wasn't just money or a name. It was our trust. And once trust is broken, it doesn't just disappear, it shifts. It moves into the hands of those strong enough to use it wisely. That night, when my husband met my eyes through the crowd, that's what I saw. Not anger, but understanding. He knew what I knew. We had given our son everything. Now it was time to take back what we built. Not out of revenge, but to remind him. Family may forgive, but it never forgets who truly earned its foundation. When I walked out of that crowded room, I thought I was leaving alone. The laughter behind me grew faint, but I could still feel the weight of my husband's stare on my back. He didn't call after me, didn't tell our son to stop, didn't say a word at all. But sometimes silence says more than anger ever could. I saw his eyes across the table before I turned away. Sharp, steady, and unblinking. For years, sickness had dulled them, but that night, something old returned. Something strong. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me harder than the humiliation. I leaned against the wall, breathing in the night, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Inside, I could still hear the muffled clatter of plates, fake laughter filling the space that love had just left. But through the window, I caught one last glimpse of my husband. He was still seated, motionless, his glass untouched. His eyes weren't on the guests. They were fixed on the door I had walked through. There was no pity in that look. Only purpose. It was the same look he had when he started the company 40 years ago, when every man told him he'd fail, and he built something from nothing anyway. Back then, he used to say, "A man's silence isn't weakness, it's calculation." That night I understood exactly what he meant. When I reached home, I half expected him to come after me, to tell me not to take it to heart. That's what we always did. Swallowed hurt and called it family. But when the front door opened hours later, his footsteps were slow, measured. He hung his coat, placed his hat on the hook, and came to sit beside me in the dim light of the living room. The clock ticked. The house was quiet, and still. He said nothing. We sat there for a long time, the silence between us thick but not empty. I didn't ask him what he was thinking. I already knew. I could see it in his hands. Steady now, no longer trembling like before. In that moment, it felt like the years of illness had lifted from him, replaced by something sharper than strength. Clarity. He wasn't just my husband again. He was the man who once built an empire from faith and fury. He looked at the old photo on the mantel, the one of us with our son as a boy, all smiles and scraped knees. For a moment, his eyes softened, then hardened again. I could tell he was weighing every memory, every sacrifice, against what had just happened. That quiet balance between love and disappointment. And I knew what side it was falling toward. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost cold. He didn't talk about anger. He talked about respect. He talked about legacy. He talked about how easily a name can rot when its roots are poisoned by pride. He didn't raise his tone, but I felt every word in my bones. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to himself, to the man who had given too much to a son who no longer understood worth. After that night, he didn't rest. The next morning before breakfast, he was already making phone calls. I watched from the doorway as he searched through his old briefcase, pulling out folders I hadn't seen in years. His hands moved with certainty, like a man remembering his own strength. I realized then that he wasn't planning a conversation. He was planning a correction. That look he gave me at the party had meant one thing. He wasn't going to let it end like that. Not with humiliation. Not with silence. Our son may have kicked me out of a room, but my husband was about to show him who really owned the walls around it. That night had exposed more than disrespect. It had reignited something powerful. And as I watched him gather papers and make notes, I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't alone in my pain. I had a partner again, one who had decided that the next move would be made not out of anger, but out of justice. That night was longer than any I can remember. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No music, no voices, just the low hum of the old clock in the hallway. I sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the moonlight touch the edge of the garden we had planted together decades ago. My husband was asleep inside, though I knew he hadn't really slept in years. Neither of us did. Not since our son began changing. Not since pride started sounding louder than love. I stared out into the dark, thinking about every stage of his life. His first steps, his first scraped knee, his first job. Each memory felt like a small betrayal now, not because it was bad, but because it was good. And it reminded me of how far we'd fallen from that simple goodness. I wondered when exactly my son had learned to speak with coldness instead of care. I replayed that moment at the party again and again, his voice sharp, his tone public, the way he made me feel small in front of people who once respected us. I had raised him to stand tall, but I hadn't taught him how to bend, not even for love. My eyes stung, but I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that in the past. Grief feels different when it hardens. It doesn't pour out anymore. It sits inside you, like ice. That's what I felt that night. Cold clarity. Pain doesn't always make you weak. Sometimes it makes you see things for what they really are. Inside, I could hear my husband shifting in his chair. He was restless, the way he always got when his mind was turning. I knew that look he'd given me at the party hadn't disappeared with sleep. He was already planning, already thinking, already preparing something he hadn't said out loud yet. For 40 years, we'd faced everything together. Debt, sickness, loss. But this was different. This was personal. This was a betrayal by blood, and no parent prepares for that. The night grew colder. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I folded and refolded the same napkin until my hands hurt. At one point, I walked to my son's old room. It hadn't changed much since he left. The same trophies, the same faded posters, the same smell of the life he once had before the money and arrogance came. I sat on his bed and ran my hand across the old wooden frame, remembering how I used to tuck him in when storms scared him. I used to tell him, no matter how dark it gets, you're safe here. But standing there now, I realized I was the one who wasn't safe anymore. Not from the world, but from my own child. I went back to the porch just before dawn. The street was empty, the sky still dark, but something in me had shifted. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was finished pretending that love meant silence. There comes a moment in every parent's life when they stop asking why and start deciding what next. That night, that moment came for me. When I finally saw the faint glow of sunrise, I understood what my husband had meant when he looked at me with that quiet determination. We weren't done. We were old, yes, but we still had our minds, our names, and the paper trails of everything we'd built. My son might have thrown me out of a room, but the foundation of his comfort, the money, the company, the reputation, still stood on ground I helped lay. By the time my husband came into the kitchen, the kettle was still warm. He didn't speak, just poured himself tea and sat across from me. We didn't need words anymore. We'd both decided. He would take the lead in what was coming. I would stand by him, as I always had. Not as a mother grieving, but as a woman reclaiming what she'd built. That morning, grief stopped being a feeling. It became a plan, and for the first time in years I felt steady again. Not happy, not healed, but ready. When dawn came, the house was still, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was focused. My husband woke before me, though I could tell he hadn't slept at all. The morning light spilled across the table where he sat with a cup of tea and the leather folder that held every important document of our life. The business papers, the property deeds, the trust forms we once made together. He had laid them out neatly, every page aligned, every pen ready. His face looked calm, but I recognized that calmness. It was the same look he wore before every major decision in our lives. He didn't speak immediately, and I didn't rush him. The air between us was quiet, but charged, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. I could see the small tremor in his hands, not from illness, but from resolve. Finally, he said softly, "Tomorrow, he'll learn what family means. No anger, no bitterness, just certainty." That one sentence told me everything. He opened the folder and began sorting through each paper methodically. The company's ownership structure, the trust agreement, the bank accounts, the property shares. Everything that carried our name was being reviewed line by line. For years, those documents had sat untouched, symbols of stability. Now they were tools, quiet weapons forged by wisdom and time. I watched his eyes scan each page like a craftsman inspecting his finest work for cracks. He paused at one page, the company deed where our son's name appeared beside his. That signature had once made us proud. Now it looked like a stain. My husband pressed his thumb against it for a moment before sliding the document into a new folder. He didn't tear it. He didn't curse it. He simply filed it under review. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, I understood it. The time for pleading was over. This was now a matter of correction, not emotion. He made a list in his careful handwriting. I couldn't see every word, but I caught glimpses. Solicitor, transfer, trust revision, ownership rights. These weren't the words of revenge. They were the words of control, of reclaiming dignity. He wasn't doing this to punish our son. He was doing it to protect what remained of our name. And me. After an hour of quiet work, he looked up at me. There was no smile, no comfort, just the same calm determination that had once built our future. He said, "We gave him everything. Now we'll take back only what was ours." I nodded, because there was nothing left to say. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like a balance was finally being restored. He picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. Our family solicitor, a man who had been with us since the early days of the business. I heard only fragments of the conversation, but I could tell the tone was formal. The kind of tone that carries authority without raising its voice. When he hung up, he said quietly, "He'll come this afternoon." Then he reached for my hand. For the first time that night, he looked tired. Not weak, but deeply worn. "I should have stood up sooner," he whispered. I squeezed his hand gently because I knew he wasn't just talking about the party. He was talking about years of silence, years of letting small disrespect slide because we believed time would fix it. But time doesn't fix pride. It feeds it. That day, I saw something in him I hadn't seen in years. Not just strength, but clarity. He wasn't sick anymore. He wasn't defeated. He was awake. The quiet man who once built a business from dust had returned, and this time he wasn't building something. He was dismantling a mistake. By evening, when the solicitor arrived, the house felt lighter. Papers were signed, statements were prepared, and steps were put in motion that would change everything. My husband didn't raise his voice once. He didn't have to. The decisions made that day were stronger than any argument, sharper than any punishment. When it was done, he closed the leather folder, placed it neatly on the table, and looked at me. "He'll understand soon," he said simply. I believed him. Because sometimes the strongest stand a father can take isn't a fight, it's a signature. The following morning began like any other, but beneath the calm surface, a quiet storm was gathering. My husband sat at the breakfast table dressed neatly, his papers organized, his tone measured. There was no anger in him, only purpose. By 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Our old solicitor, Mr. Warren, arrived exactly on time, briefcase in hand and curiosity written across his face. He'd been with us since the beginning, through every loan, contract, and legal turn that built our family name. He greeted us softly, sensing this wasn't a casual meeting. My husband motioned for him to sit. The leather folder lay open on the table like an unspoken accusation. As the kettle whistled, I poured tea in silence, watching the two men who had shaped our lives more than anyone else. One through faith, the other through law. The air was heavy with decades of trust, ready to be rearranged in the space of an hour. My husband spoke first, calm but firm. He explained what had happened at the party, though he left out the emotion. There were no dramatics, only facts. Our son humiliated his mother publicly, he said, his voice steady. He did it in the same house that her hands helped pay for, the same roof that carries both our names. That cannot stand. Mr. Warren didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, opened his notepad, and began writing. Then my husband continued, outlining what he wanted done, every detail rehearsed in his mind long before he spoke it aloud. First, the transfer of controlling shares in the company back into his and my joint trust. Second, the immediate removal of our son's managerial authority and financial access. Third, an amendment to the family will, ensuring that any future inheritance would depend on respect, not entitlement. I listened quietly, letting his words settle in the air. Each sentence sounded like a nail being driven into a door that would never open again. But there was no malice in it, just justice, clean and deliberate. Mr. Warren looked at him thoughtfully. "You're sure?" he asked. "Once this is signed, there's no going back. It will take effect immediately." My husband nodded once. "I'm sure," he said. "He made a public statement last night, whether he meant to or not. Now I'm making mine, legally." For a brief moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. Then Mr. Warren reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Fresh drafts of the trust, pre-prepared templates for ownership revisions, and will amendments ready to be filled. It was as if he'd known this day might come. Perhaps he had. Old lawyers often sense the quiet fractures in families long before they break. As the pen moved across the papers, my husband's hand didn't shake once. His signature, bold and familiar, appeared on every line that mattered. I sat beside him, signing where needed, my own handwriting steadier than I expected. Each stroke felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity that had been taken in that single cruel moment at the party. When the final paper was done, Mr. Warren leaned back, reading through each clause again for accuracy. Then he looked at us both and said softly, You've done the right thing. Respect should never be negotiable, not even between parent and child. My husband gave a faint smile. This isn't revenge, he replied. It's a reminder. Mr. Warren gathered the documents, packed them neatly into his briefcase, and promised to have everything filed and registered within 24 hours. Before leaving, he placed a hand on my shoulder, a quiet gesture of respect, and said, "He'll come to understand, Mrs. Taylor. Maybe not today, but someday." After he left, my husband sat still for a long while, staring out the window. His reflection on the glass looked older, yes, but somehow lighter. The burden he'd carried, the guilt of watching our son drift into arrogance, seemed to ease. When he finally turned to me, there was a trace of peace in his eyes. "He'll face the truth soon," he said simply. I nodded, because I knew it wasn't just our son who would face it. The entire family, the business, even the people who had laughed that night would learn something. That the foundation of power isn't money or youth, but the quiet strength of the ones who built it. That meeting wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, and it didn't need to be. But it changed everything. The papers that left our house that morning carried the weight of a father's final lesson. One taught not through shouting, but through the law he trusted more than pride. A week later, Sunday came again. The day my son always visited us for lunch, wearing that same confident smile that made neighbors think our family was perfect. I had set the table as usual, the smell of roasted lamb filling the air, the silverware shining under soft daylight. My husband sat quietly in his chair, calm as ever. But there was a stillness around him that didn't belong to peace. It belonged to certainty. Everything had already been arranged. When the knock came, my son entered as though nothing had happened the week before. He kissed me lightly on the cheek, pretending the party hadn't happened, pretending I hadn't been humiliated. I played along. I poured tea, asked him about work, listened to his small talk. But my husband didn't engage. He just nodded, his hand resting on the same leather folder that had sat on our table every morning that week. Minutes later, the sound of another car pulling into the driveway interrupted the conversation. My son frowned, expecting no one else. When the door opened, Mr. Warren, our solicitor, stepped in, briefcase in hand. My son's smile froze. The last time he'd seen that man was years ago, when the company was first transferred into his name. My husband rose from his chair, slow but deliberate, and gestured for the solicitor to join us. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air tighter. My son began to speak, his voice sharp and defensive, but my husband lifted a hand, a quiet command that stopped him mid-sentence. Mr. Warren opened his briefcase, withdrew several documents, and placed them on the table one by one. The sound of paper sliding against wood felt louder than words. "These," the solicitor began calmly, "are the updated trust deeds and company ownership transfers." He turned to my husband for confirmation. My husband nodded. Then, looking directly at our son, he said evenly, "Your name no longer carries authority in the company or over this house." The silence that followed was heavy enough to drown in. My son's expression shifted. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the kind of fear only pride feels when it realizes it has no ground left. He reached for the papers, scanning them quickly, eyes wide. Each page carried signatures, stamps, and the cold, undeniable truth that he had been removed from power completely. He looked from his father to me, trying to speak, but no words came. His lips trembled slightly as though the apology he owed us had been locked behind the same arrogance that once drove him to throw me out. I didn't say anything. I just watched. Years of patience, sleepless nights, and silent tears had all led to this. Not vengeance, but justice written in black ink. His wife, who had stayed near the door, finally stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes darting between the documents and her husband. She reached out for him, but he pulled away, staring blankly at the papers that had once symbolized his control. The confidence he wore so easily was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before: awareness. My husband stood slowly, his back straight, his voice firm. "You humiliated your mother in front of family," he said quietly. "You disrespected the woman who made everything you have possible. I will not let you inherit what you no longer value." There were no raised voices, no shouting, just that single steady sentence. Final, irreversible. My son looked at me then, as though hoping I would intervene, soften the blow, forgive the unforgivable. But I didn't. I sat still, hands folded, and met his gaze without flinching. The woman he had called weak now looked at him without fear. The silence between us said more than words ever could. After a few moments, Mr. Warren gathered the papers again, sliding them into his briefcase with quiet efficiency. The sound of the latch closing felt like the end of a chapter. My husband nodded to him, then turned back to our son. "You're still our son," he said, "but not our partner." Then he walked out of the room, leaving behind the echo of calm authority. When the front door closed, my son remained standing, staring at the empty chair where his father had sat. He looked smaller somehow, not in size, but in spirit. Pride had stripped him of everything, and now all that was left was the truth. I stood and walked past him, touching the edge of the table as I went. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel helpless. I felt free. The house that once held shame now held justice. And in that silence, I realized something. Sometimes the most powerful revenge doesn't shout. It simply stands up. The days that followed the confrontation were strangely quiet. For years, our home had been filled with noise, arguments, opinions, demands, and the endless hum of my son's voice explaining why he knew best. Now, all that was gone. The silence felt heavy, but it wasn't sad. It was peaceful, like a storm that had finally passed. Our son didn't return the next day, nor the one after. But by the third morning, a car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window as he stepped out. Not the confident man who had once strutted through our front door, but someone smaller, slower, uncertain. He stood there for a while, staring at the house as if seeing it for the first time. Then he rang the bell. My husband didn't answer. He let the sound echo and fade on its own. Later, the phone started ringing. First from relatives, then from his wife. Word had spread quickly through the family circle. Everyone knew something had shifted. The son who once controlled everything, the business, the family name, even the tone of the gatherings, was now without a title, without authority, without control. It was as if the air around him had thinned. The same people who had once laughed at his jokes now spoke his name with pity. He came again 2 days later, this time alone. I opened the door just enough to see his face. There was no anger left, only confusion and guilt. His eyes darted around like he was looking for a way back into his old life. But the house behind me was no longer his to enter. My husband was upstairs reading the newspaper as if nothing had changed. The silence between father and son was not cruel. It was deliberate. When my son finally spoke, his voice was smaller, stripped of its usual arrogance. He tried to explain himself, said he was tired that night, that the drink had made him stupid, that he hadn't meant what he said. But the truth was, he had meant every word. You can't unmake cruelty by calling it a mistake. He asked to speak to his father, but I told him there was nothing left to discuss. The decisions were made, signed, and sealed. The company didn't belong to him anymore. The house wasn't under his name. The accounts were locked. Everything he had treated as his own had returned to its rightful owners. He looked at me then, truly looked, for the first time in years, and I could see the moment it hit him. The wealth, the business, the comfort, the power, none of it had ever been his. It had all come from the two people he had taken for granted, and with a few signatures, it had all been taken back. His wife left a week later. She couldn't stand the humiliation. She moved back to her parents' home, saying she couldn't live with a man who had lost everything. For the first time, he was alone. No business to hide behind, no admirers to applaud him, no one left to blame. The silence he had forced upon me was now his companion. Our relatives stopped asking questions. The story of that night spread like wildfire, not from us, but from those who had seen him crumble in the courtroom, pale and speechless as his father reclaimed what was his. The same man who had once mocked me for being old-fashioned was now the subject of whispers about pride, inheritance, and karma. Sometimes I saw his car parked down the road at night. He never came in. He would just sit there with the headlights off, watching the windows, maybe waiting for an invitation that would never come. I didn't hate him, but I didn't pity him either. Pity is for those who are victims of circumstance, not for those who dig their own graves with arrogance. My husband never spoke much about it. He simply said he needed to learn that family isn't a privilege, it's a responsibility. And then he folded his newspaper and carried on with his day. That was the end of it for him. But for me, it lingered, not as pain, but as understanding. I had spent years believing motherhood meant endless forgiveness, but that night at the party had taught me something new. Sometimes forgiveness is letting someone fall. Sometimes love is refusing to soften the ground beneath them. And so, our son's downfall wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or tears. It came with silence. A silence heavy enough to crush the pride he once carried like a crown. In the end, he wasn't destroyed by us. He was destroyed by his own reflection, finally forced to face what he had become. I often think back to that night, the party, the shouting, the shame, and I realize now that it was never about anger. It was about recognition. All I had ever wanted was to be treated as the woman who built the very ground he stood on. But that night, when my son told me to leave, he made me see something I had ignored for too long. Some people only learn respect when silence answers where love once spoke. Now, when I sit on the porch with my husband, I can finally breathe without the weight of disappointment. We talk about the garden, the sea breeze, the small bakery down the road that we plan to visit. The world feels calm again. Sometimes I hear my phone buzz, another message from my son, another attempt to bridge the distance. I read them, but I don't reply. Forgiveness doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry the pain any longer. I have learned that motherhood is not about being endlessly available. It's not about saving those who enjoy watching you suffer. It's about knowing when to protect your peace. My son thought power came from control, from running a company, from commanding people, from speaking louder than everyone else. But real power, I discovered, is in restraint. It's in walking away when you could destroy, in staying silent when you've already won. There's something sacred about quiet justice. It doesn't make headlines, but it changes lives. That night at the party, when he told me to get out, I felt like I had lost my place in my own story. But the moment my husband stood up for me, I realized I had never been powerless. I had just been patient. The law, the papers, the decisions, they were tools. But the real victory wasn't in the documents. It was in dignity. The neighbors still talk about what happened, though never directly to us. They say, "You must be so proud of your husband." And I am. But more than that, I'm proud of myself. I didn't shout back. I didn't break down. I held my silence until it spoke for me. That's something most people don't understand. Revenge doesn't always have to roar. Sometimes it whispers through the walls of the same house where you were once humiliated. There are nights when I wonder if my son truly understands what he lost. Not money, not the company, but trust, the kind that once made our home warm. Maybe one day he'll earn it back. Maybe he won't. But until then, I have peace. The same peace I prayed for during the nights I cried into my pillow, wishing I had done something sooner. When I look in the mirror now, I don't see a mother who was cast aside. I see a woman who reclaimed her voice without raising it. A wife who found strength beside a man who refused to let disrespect stand. And a mother who finally learned that love without boundaries becomes self-destruction. So, if you're listening to this, I want you to remember, dignity is not negotiable. When someone humiliates you in front of others, you don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight to be seen. You just need to act, calmly, quietly, and with purpose. Because sometimes, the most powerful revenge is simply peace that no one can take from you. He kicked me out that night, thinking it would end my place in the family. But when my husband stood up, the whole world saw what true respect looks like. And in that moment, the shame that once burned me turned into strength that would never fade. Now I sit here with a clear heart and an easy breath. My story isn't about revenge. It's about balance. The day a mother stopped begging for love and started demanding honor.